The 1970s was supposed to be the decade when Hollywood grew up, when westerns stopped looking like fairy tales and started showing the real frontier. But here's the twist. When directors finally turned the camera on the bloody side of history, the censors panicked. Limbs hacked off, villages torched, women and children caught in the crossfire. Audiences had never seen this much brutality on horseback. So, what westerns were so raw that theaters almost refused to show them? Soldier Blue 1970. Forget John Wayne's clean-cut cavalry rides. Soldier Blue blew the genre wide open with a massacre that audiences couldn't stomach. Based loosely on the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, the film doesn't flinch. Cavalrymen gunned down villagers in a frenzy, children included, with scalping, beheadings, and executions that play out in harrowing detail. This wasn't just violence for shock. It was a political statement. Director Ralph Nelson wanted Americans to see Vietnam mirrored in the Wild West. The 20-minute massacre scene triggered outrage. At early screenings, horrified viewers shouted, "Burn the theater!" The MPAA initially threatened an X rating, forcing the studio to trim the most graphic shots just to scrape an R. Across the Atlantic, British censors slashed out almost 7 minutes, and when the film aired on TV in 1980, they cut the massacre entirely. It wouldn't be seen uncut there for over 2 decades. Despite the backlash, Soldier Blue made money, pulling in more than $8 million on a modest budget. But critics were split. Some called it a brave, unflinching look at American history, while others saw it as exploitative carnage dressed up as social commentary. Love it or hate it, Soldier Blue proved that westerns didn't need to be romantic, and once audiences saw the darker side of frontier myths, there was no going back. The Hunting Party. 1971. Imagine Gene Hackman, not as a hero, but as a sadistic rancher who'll do anything to get his wife back. That's The Hunting Party, a revenge western so vicious that even its producer couldn't sit through it. Legend has it, Helmut Dantine vomited during the first screening. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. The film delights in its cruelty, torture, dismemberment, even a scene where a man is forced to eat his own fingers. Hackman's character believes Oliver Reed has kidnapped his wife, played by Candice Bergen, and his obsession pushes him into a spiral of brutality. Director Don Medford refused to soften anything, arguing the frontier wasn't polite, and people died horribly. But the studio panicked, demanding cuts to the most disturbing sequences. One especially graphic assault scene involving Bergen's character was trimmed, but the R rating still stuck like a scarlet letter. Some theaters refused to screen it at all. Audiences expecting a traditional rescue western got something closer to a nightmare. The violence wasn't glamorous, it was grotesque, and critics had no clue what to do with it. Some dismissed it as mean-spirited exploitation. Others admired its refusal to sanitize the Old West. Either way, The Hunting Party left blood on the floor and a bitter taste in viewers' mouths. It remains one of the most extreme westerns Hollywood ever dared to release. Ulzana's Raid, 1972. When Burt Lancaster signed on for Ulzana's Raid, audiences thought they were getting another Noble Scout story. Instead, director Robert Aldrich gave them a cold blast of realism. The film follows an Apache warrior raid across Arizona, and Aldrich doesn't spare a single detail. Settlers are ambushed, tortured, and mutilated in scenes that had test audiences walking out in disgust. The violence isn't stylized, it's matter of fact, and that made it even more disturbing. United Artists begged Aldrich to trim it, but he refused. He argued the brutality wasn't exploitation, it was history. Still, British censors balked, calling it beyond acceptable limits, and outright banned the uncut version until decades later. Even in America, theaters braced for controversy, and many reviewers attacked it as unnecessarily harsh. But others recognized its brilliance, seeing it as both a Western and a war film rolled into one. Quentin Tarantino later called it his favorite Western of the 70s. For Lancaster, the role showed an aging scout haunted by endless cycles of violence. And the film doesn't offer redemption or easy answers. Ulzana's Raid stripped away the myth of the West and replaced it with something uglier, a world where cruelty and vengeance swallowed everyone. It's not an easy watch, but that was the point. Aldrich forced audiences to confront what frontier violence really looked like, long before Hollywood was ready to handle the truth. The Culpeper Cattle Company, 1972. At first glance, the Culpeper Cattle Course sounds like a wholesome cowboy adventure. A starry-eyed teenager begs a trail boss to join a cattle drive, dreaming of cowboy glory. But what he gets is a waking nightmare. Director Dick Richards wanted realism, not romance, and he delivered. Gunfights aren't heroic, they're sloppy, brutal, and devastating. In one infamous dinner scene, a man's face is literally blown apart, leaving audiences gasping. Studio execs at 20th Century Fox were horrified. They couldn't believe Richards had shot something this unflinching. The censors demanded heavy edits, and Richards fought tooth and nail to preserve the grit. Still, entire sequences were trimmed to avoid an X rating. Even with cuts, it carried a hard R, and many theaters were hesitant to screen such a grim picture with no big stars to soften the blow. The irony? On a shoestring budget, under $1 million, the Culpeper Cattle Cour grossed around $4 million, proving audiences were ready for realism, even if it came with blood and mud. Critics later praised its raw authenticity, calling it a gritty antidote to glossy Western myths. For viewers who thought cowboy life was all sunsets and spurs, this movie delivered a gut punch. The West wasn't romantic, it was nasty. And the Culpeper Cattle Co. didn't let anyone forget it. Lawman, 1971. William Holden as a revenge-fueled rancher. Sounds like a classic Western, right? Except Lawman wasn't interested in playing by the rules. The film opens with a family massacre so vicious that censors nearly slapped it with an X rating. Director Daniel Mann leaned hard into graphic detail, showing not just the violence, but its messy aftermath. For audiences raised on sanitized gunfights, it was a rude awakening. The story follows Holden's character as he recruits convicts to hunt down the killers, and the brutality doesn't let up. Torture scenes drag on uncomfortably. Victims beg for mercy, and one prolonged sequence of slow death had test audiences recoiling. The studio demanded cuts, but Mann argued the violence was essential. It was the horror that motivated revenge. Still, theaters refused to book it, worried about backlash, and critics were merciless in their reviews. Financially, it tanked, barely scraping back $2.5 million on a $3 million budget. But in hindsight, Lawman deserves credit. It tried to show what vengeance really looks like when stripped of Hollywood gloss. There's no satisfaction here, just endless cycles of cruelty. Maybe that's why audiences rejected it at the time. It was too raw, too cynical, too violent for a world still expecting Westerns to offer heroes. Lawman showed the cost of blood, and the price was more than most viewers wanted to pay. Chatto's Land, 1972. Charles Bronson had already built a reputation for playing tough guys, but Chatto's Land took things to another level. He plays Chatto, a half Apache who kills a racist sheriff in self-defense and flees into the desert. Sounds simple enough, but what follows is a descent into savagery, not from Chatto, but from the posse sent to capture him. As they track him across the barren landscape, their own behavior unravels until they're more barbaric than the man they're hunting. Director Michael Winner didn't sugarcoat anything. One of the most disturbing moments involves the posse attacking a native woman, a sequence so brutal that United Artists threatened to pull the plug entirely. Winner fought back, saying, "This is what actually happened on the frontier. Americans just can't face their own history." Still, the studio forced compromises, trimming scenes that risked an X rating. Even after cuts, the movie shocked audiences. They expected Bronson's usual stoic anti-hero, not a film that held a mirror to American racism and cruelty. The budget was around $1.5 million, but it grossed nearly $6 million worldwide, proving controversy sells. Critics split right down the middle. Some called it exploitative trash. Others hailed it as an unflinching look at the violent hypocrisy of Western myths. Bronson himself later admitted it was the most honest role he'd ever played. Watching Chatto's Land isn't comfortable, but that was the point. The Legend of Nigger Charlie, 1972. With a title guaranteed to spark controversy, this film was destined for censorship battles before a single frame rolled. The Legend of Nigger Charlie told the story of a runaway slave who becomes a gunslinger, turning the tables on his oppressors in a blaze of violence. For a genre that had long ignored or caricatured black characters, this was a shock to the system. Fred Williamson stars as Charlie, and he brings both charisma and fury to the role. The film revels in its revenge sequences. Chains are turned into weapons, overseers are cut down, and the oppressed finally get the upper hand. But the language and graphic brutality pushed censors over the edge. TV edits chopped the title entirely, marketing it as simply The Legend of Charlie, while theaters in certain states refused to screen it at all. Critics were baffled. Some dismissed it as blaxploitation in cowboy hats. Others saw it as a groundbreaking attempt to put black heroes at the center of the Western myth. Either way, audiences showed up, and the film pulled in strong box office numbers, spawning sequels. What Hollywood didn't want to admit was obvious. Charlie gave viewers a catharsis they weren't getting anywhere else. Violent, raw, and unapologetic, it forced the Western to confront a history it had long tried to whitewash. Cry for Me, Billy, 1972. If you thought Westerns were all about dusty shootouts, Cry for Me, Billy will prove you wrong in the most harrowing way. The story follows Billy, a lonely cowboy who falls in love with a native woman named Flower. But when a vicious group of cavalrymen attack, the romance shatters into one of the most disturbing sequences of the decade. The assault on Flower was so graphic that censors hacked it to pieces for theatrical release. The film doesn't stop there. Billy's quest for vengeance is painted in blood, with long, drawn-out revenge scenes that show cruelty from both sides. Critics were divided over whether it was an honest attempt at realism or just cruelty for cruelty's sake. Either way, the MPAA forced edits, and theaters in conservative regions refused to book it. For viewers who did see it, the movie left scars. Even today, Cry for Me, Billy is remembered less for its love story than for its shocking violence, and it's often lumped in with Soldier Blue as part of the revisionist wave that tore down the old heroic frontier myth. By stripping away romanticism, it exposed how raw and ugly frontier life could be, and in doing so, pushed the Western past what 1970s audiences were ready to accept. The Last Hard Men, 1976. By the mid-70s, Westerns were dying at the box office, and The Last Hard Men didn't do much to help. Starring Gregory Peck and James Coburn, it told the story of a vengeful outlaw wreaking havoc after escaping from prison. On paper, it sounded like a classic setup. In execution, it was one of the nastiest Westerns the decade produced. The violence goes further than most audiences expected from a big studio release. Scalping, throat-slashing, and one prolonged scene of assault left viewers reeling. Even the actors seemed shocked. Coburn leaned into his sadistic role with chilling glee, while Peck looked almost out of place in such a brutal setting. The censors demanded trims, but the movie still wore its R rating like a warning sign, and many theaters hesitated to show it. The result was a box office disappointment. Critics trashed it, calling it ugly and mean-spirited, but in hindsight, The Last Hard Men was part of the final wave of revisionist westerns that refused to hide the brutality of the frontier. It wasn't polished, it wasn't romantic, and it certainly wasn't comfortable. But if you wanted to see just how far Hollywood was willing to push the genre before it collapsed, this was it. Doc, 1971. Everyone knows the story of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, right? Except Doc decided to throw out the legend and show the dirt underneath. Directed by Frank Perry, the film starred Stacy Keach as Holliday and Harris Yulin as Earp. But instead of larger-than-life heroes, we get men who are selfish, flawed, and willing to spill blood without hesitation. The violence isn't constant, but when it hits, it's ugly. Shootouts aren't heroic standoffs, they're chaotic and messy. One scene involving a close-range shotgun blast had censors scrambling, and Perry fought bitterly to keep the grittiest moments intact. He wanted to strip away the mythology and show that these men weren't role models. They were killers. Audiences weren't ready for this. Critics accused it of desecrating American folklore, and theaters quietly dropped it after poor test screenings. But Doc has gained a cult reputation for daring to drag the Old West through the mud. By turning Wyatt Earp into a corrupt opportunist and Holiday into a coughing, violent gambler, it asked a question no other Western of its time dared. What if our heroes were never heroes at all? For that honesty, Doc earned its spot among the most censored and controversial Westerns of the decade. Dirty Little Billy, 1972. Forget the romantic outlaw. Dirty Little Billy strips Billy the Kid down to a grimy, mean teenager stumbling through the mud of the frontier. Michael J. Pollard plays Billy as a twitchy, unhinged kid who can barely handle a gun, let alone become a legend. Director Stan Dragoti leans into the filth, muddy streets, rotting food, bar fights that feel less like Hollywood choreography and more like two drunks clawing for survival. The violence isn't stylish. It's awkward, messy, and uncomfortable. When Billy stabs or shoots, there's no heroism, just desperation. Test audiences were horrified at how far it went in tearing down a folk hero. Censors cut several sequences of knife fights and close-up gore to secure an R rating. But even then, the film had trouble getting booked in mainstream theaters. Critics were split. Some dismissed it as sleazy exploitation. Others praised its radical realism. But no one denied it felt different. Dirty Little Billy doesn't build the myth of the West. It dismantles it one sloppy killing at a time. Maybe that's why audiences rejected it. Too much truth, not enough glamour. Most movies about Billy the Kid make him look like a folk hero, a rebel with swagger. Dirty Little Billy spits in the face of that myth. Director Stan Dragoti drags Billy through the mud, literally. Played by Michael J. Pollard, this Billy isn't confident or heroic. He's awkward, twitchy, and mean, stumbling around Kansas in a world that feels more like a sewer than a frontier. The movie wallows in grime. Streets are caked in filth, saloons stink of rot, and every gunfight looks more like a drunken brawl than a heroic showdown. Pollard's Billy learns violence not as a calling, but as survival. He doesn't outdraw anyone. He fumbles, panics, and when he kills, it feels desperate and cruel. That's what made the movie so unsettling. It wasn't myth. It was squalor. Censors were rattled by its knife fights, its close-up killings, and the bleak tone. To get an R rating, entire sequences were shortened, but even trimmed, it carried a nasty edge. The public wasn't ready. Critics dismissed it as sleazy and depressing, and audiences stayed away. Yet over time, Dirty Little Billy found defenders who admired its raw realism. It's not fun, it's not pretty, and that's the point. Dirty Little Billy stripped away the glamour and showed how legends might really start, not with courage, but with filth and desperation. It's the Western equivalent of tearing down a statue and staring at the cracked, ugly foundation beneath. The Deadly Trackers, 1973. The Deadly Trackers should have been a hard-hitting masterpiece. It started with Sam Fuller, a director known for pushing boundaries, at the helm. Fuller wanted to craft a revenge Western soaked in blood and cruelty, something that would burn the cowboy myth down to ashes. But Hollywood wasn't ready. His footage was deemed too violent, too grim, and before he could finish, he was out. The studio fired him, reshot scenes, and stitched together what remained. What survived was still rough. Richard Harris stars as Sheriff Kilpatrick, whose family is slaughtered by a gang led by a sneering Rod Taylor. The sheriff hunts them across the frontier, and the violence that follows is relentless. Gunfights don't fade to black. They linger on mangled bodies. One sequence of torture reportedly had censors threatening an X rating, and even trimmed. It was enough to make audiences squirm. The production was a mess. Scenes felt uneven, the tone shifted awkwardly, and critics tore it apart for being both brutal and incoherent. But beneath the chaos, something raw survived. You can still see glimpses of Fuller's vision, flashes of a movie that wanted to strip away all comfort and show revenge as nothing but a bloody downward spiral. The Deadly Trackers bombed on release, But over time, it gained a reputation as a curiosity, a fractured film that still packs a punch. Even censored, it showed that Westerns in the 70s weren't just struggling to find audiences, they were wrestling with their own identity, caught between myth and mayhem. Valdez is Coming. 1971. Burt Lancaster was no stranger to frontier roles, but Valdez is Coming gave him one of his most haunting characters. He plays Bob Valdez, a Mexican-American constable tricked into killing an innocent man. When he demands compensation for the victim's widow, the powerful rancher, Frank Tanner, humiliates him, tying him to a cross and leaving him to die. Valdez survives, but the quiet constable is gone. In his place rises a relentless avenger. The violence in Valdez is Coming is precise and purposeful. When Valdez strikes back, he doesn't hold back. He ambushes Tanner's men, strings them up, and shoots with merciless accuracy. Lancaster gives Valdez a quiet intensity, making every act of retribution sting twice as hard. But the brutality pushed boundaries. Censors cut down scenes of torture and execution to avoid an X rating, softening edges that Lancaster fought to keep sharp. Audiences expecting a noble hero story were blindsided. This wasn't about law and order. It was about justice clawed back in blood. Critics were uneasy. Some praised Lancaster's performance. Others balked at the harsh tone and the idea of a Mexican-American hero delivering punishment to white oppressors. The studio didn't know how to market it, and the film slipped under the radar. Yet in time, Valdez is Coming earned cult respect. It wasn't glossy, it wasn't heroic, and it wasn't safe. It was about one man demanding dignity in a world determined to deny it. For Lancaster, it was a late career triumph. For Westerns, it was a sign the old myths were crumbling. Bad Company, 1972. At first glance, Bad Company looks like a coming-of-age story. Two boys, Drew Dixon and Jake Rumsey, played by Barry Brown and a young Jeff Bridges, head west during the Civil War. It should have been a tale of adventure. Instead, Robert Benton's film drops them into a nightmare. These aren't heroic cowboys. They're hungry, desperate teenagers who stumble into a world where violence is the only rule. What shocked audiences wasn't the setup, but the execution. Children rob travelers, gangs burn homesteads, and young lives end in brutal, sudden ways. One sequence shows a group of boys luring settlers into an ambush, and when the violence erupts, it's chilling because of their youth. Censors pushed for heavy trims to avoid the dreaded X rating, and Benton reluctantly cut moments of gore. Even then, the movie carried a hard R, scaring off family audiences who might have expected something gentler. Critics were split. Some hailed it as an honest portrait of innocence lost, a war story in Western clothing. Others called it cruel and nihilistic. Financially, it stumbled, unable to sell itself as either adventure or exploitation. But in hindsight, Bad Company stands out for daring to make youth the face of violence. Benton's film showed that the frontier didn't just destroy hardened men, it devoured kids too. That was the twist. The Civil War didn't just divide states. It churned out orphans who became outlaws, boys who became killers. In Bad Company, growing up meant dying fast, and audiences weren't ready for that kind of honesty. The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid. 1972. Jesse James and the Younger Brothers have been romanticized for generations, but the Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid tears the shine off their legend. Directed by Philip Kaufman, the film dramatizes the gang's infamous 1876 robbery attempt, but instead of giving us dashing outlaws, it drags us through blood and chaos. Cliff Robertson plays Cole Younger, with Robert Duvall as Jesse James, and both are portrayed as reckless, dangerous men rather than folk heroes. The raid itself is filmed like a war zone. Civilians are cut down in the crossfire. Banks are drenched in panic. And the violence doesn't shy away from showing innocent lives torn apart. The MPAA demanded trims, cutting shots of bloody gunfire and softening civilian deaths, but even censored, it shocked viewers who thought they were getting another heroic outlaw tale. Kaufman wanted to expose the myth. He shows Jesse not as a charming rogue, but as a cold-blooded killer. Robertson's Cole is no better, caught in delusion as much as desperation. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some called it revisionist brilliance, others accused it of being pointlessly grim. Audiences were lukewarm, too unsettled by the film's refusal to glorify the James Gang. But in retrospect, the Great Northfield, Minnesota raid is one of the boldest attempts to deconstruct Western legend. By refusing to romanticize the bloodshed, Kaufman turned the story into a cautionary tale. Legends, he argued, are just killers who got lucky with publicity. It was too honest for its time, but that honesty is exactly why it endures. The 70s was the decade that tried to kill the cowboy myth, and these films swung the axe. Some shocked, some bombed, and a few earned cult status, but they all pushed Westerns past the point of no return. So what do you think? Were these directors brave truth-tellers, or just chasing shock value? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe if you love the dark corners of film history, and remember, the West was never clean.